il fiore, questo è il fiore del partigiano, questo è il fiore. Questo è il fiore del partigiano, questo è il fiore. Questo è il fiore del partigiano, questo è il fiore. Questo è il fiore del partigiano. Una mattina mi sono alzato, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Una mattina mi sono alzato e ho trovato l'invasor. Oh partigiano, portami via, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire. Questo è il fiore del partigiano. Questo è il fiore del partigiano. E se io muoio da partigiano, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Se io muoio da partigiano, tu mi vedi seppellire, e seppellire la sua montagna. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Seppellire la sua montagna sotto l'ombra di un bel fior, e seppellire la sua montagna sotto l'ombra di un bel fior. Tutte le genti che passeranno, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao.
Okay, let's good evening everybody. Let's sort this sound problem out. How do I sound right this second? Let this OBS say. Nothing OBS says is helpful. Okay, I sound fine. Let me know how this sounds when it launches. Also, do I still sound fine if I sit back here? Is that even picking anything up? Is that Is that making noise at all for the system? Okay, let's how'd that sound? How'd the video sound, actually, is the question. Yeah, but I don't have the noise gate on. Let's do... that. I'll turn off the noise suppression. Still barely come out, Naomi? Okay, the noise suppression was not working properly. Let's start with this thing on Second Thought and Communist Party of America, and then we will see where the evening takes us. Sorry about that.
In late February of 2022, Russia officially began what it has since called its special military operation in Ukraine. While this event marked a significant escalation in violence between the two countries, it was not where the conflict began. Nearly a decade ago, the United States and European imperialist powers backed a far-right coup in Ukraine that overthrew the elected government and installed a puppet regime on the border of the US's Cold War rival. At the time, this was seen as a clear provocation by the United States, and an attempt to gain a foothold to launch an eventual proxy war in the region, a reality which has been conveniently swept under the rug in recent years. But even this thinly veiled threat cannot be considered.
What did you say?
Government and installed a puppet regime on the border of the right coup in Ukraine. The United States and European imperialist powers backed a far-right coup in Ukraine that overthrew the elected government and installed a puppet regime on the border of the US's Cold War rival. At the time, this was seen as a clear provocation by the United States, and an attempt...
Why? Okay. Hang on a second. Wait, okay. Stop. The United States backed a coup to install a far-right government that the United States then saw as a provocation. Is that what he said? That's what he said. We heard that correctly, right?
Attempt to gain a foothold, installed a puppet powers backed a... Nearly a decade ago, the United States and European imperialist powers...
No, that's what he said. nearly a decade ago would be 2014, 2013, which I assume refers to Euromaidan, which was not a United States-backed coup. It was a people's uprising against Ukrainian government beating the shit out of Ukrainians. That's just straight up nonsense.
Backed a far-right coup in Ukraine that overthrew the elected government and installed a puppet regime on the border of the US's Cold War rival. At the time, this was seen as a clear provocation by the United States, and an attempt to gain a foothold to launch an eventual proxy war in the region.
No one was trying to launch a proxy war. Also, additionally, the war didn't start until shortly after Euromaidan, when Russia invades Ukraine under the guise of the LNR and DNR. Second thought's usually pretty stupid, but this is an especially stupid swallowing of propaganda.
Reality which has been conveniently swept under the rug in recent years. But even this thinly veiled threat cannot be considered the true beginning of the conflict. We'd have to go all the way back to the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union to really understand the root of the problem. The undermining and eventual destruction of the original socialist project, the brutal and sadistic economic shock therapy that followed, and the fragmenting of what had once been a strong and united people. The moment the Second World War ended, the United States began preparing for conflict with this burgeoning new economic power. The Soviet Union was rightly seen as a shining alternative to capitalism, and was a ray of hope for millions of average people around the world. And so the United States began
The citation needed, Tanky.
its long process of trying to kill this hope, drafting war plans, and even considering a preemptive nuclear strike. This is the context in which we must analyze the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What tends to get lost in mainstream coverage of this war, or any conflict that benefits the imperialist powers, is the human cost of war. Those who sign the papers and make the decrees that send entire generations into the meat grinder will never hold a gun themselves. They'll never lose a child to geopolitical jockeying. Their lifestyle won't be affected. They won't lose their homes to shelling. Their pantries will remain stocked, and their water will always be clean. But that is not the reality for the people being sent to fight, and the loved ones they're desperately trying to protect from pointless escalation and random acts of cruelty inspired by the hate and bitterness of war. As with any active conflict, exact numbers are closely guarded by the combatants. But there's no hiding all the footage that makes its way to Telegram, Twitter, and other more democratized online news sources. Conservatively, tens of thousands of people have been killed since last year, including civilians, as well as mercenaries flying in from Western countries to hunt their fellow human beings for sport. We've seen horrific footage of homes destroyed, bodies burned beyond recognition, and what looks like evidence of chemical weapons. War is a dirty, bloody business, and it only benefits the...
There has been no confirmed reports of chemical weapons used in Ukraine. Second thought is never impressed me much, but this is particularly heinous lies. All of it. Yeah, this is particularly heinous lies and horribly uninformed Russian propaganda.
The ruling class of the involved nations. The conscripts shipped off to fight in some leveled city have no chance of elevated status. Their lives won't be improved by butchering their fellow workers. They will be lucky to return home at all, and most of them with scars both physical and mental that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, those at the top talk of democracy, freedom, national determination, and invoke some mythologized past to fool the peasants into thinking they're dying for a noble cause. They are not. There must be a peaceful resolution to this conflict. We have seen in recent months that the United States remains the primary obstacle to peace in the region. As China attempts to broker a peaceful resolution,
The United States did not invade Ukraine. The United States is not the obstacle to peace. He is advocating that Russia be allowed to slaughter people and sitting here being smug about it. He is actually advocating for the genocide of Ukrainian people in the Lord of being in the name of being a tanky. Wow. And a China simp, because apparently he's much too stupid to recognize the utter failure of the USSR, or the complete failure of the Chinese Communist Party to even be communist. Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly right. Russia is not looking for a peace treaty. Russia can end the war anytime they want by marching out of Ukraine. And there are some revised reports that indicate that Ukraine's estimates of Russian losses may be much closer to accurate than we had originally thought, which was something that Hetman is actually reporting back spasms, which is not strictly speaking a symptom of COVID. So I'm a little concerned and hoping he decides to go to the hospital and get that fixed. But we will be working to get regular scheduled things to be regularly scheduled. And this Wednesday, me and the Pondering are going to debate Wick, so that'll be fun. But yeah, this is obnoxious.
The US and its lackeys call ever more loudly for increased weapons shipments and greater Western involvement. Thankfully, this conflict has coincided with the sharpening of contradictions surrounding the US. The once untouchable global hegemon is losing its grip on the rest of the world. Countless Latin American and African countries have broken ties with the US and accepted more mutually beneficial trade agreements with China. Even those countries with
who has broken ties with the US and Latin America? Central and Latin America. No one has. Here's the thing. Even if you have good intentions, and communists don't, they're not socialists, so they're not based. Even if you have good intentions, sitting here and trying to spin this nonsense into a victory isn't doing you anything to advance your cause.
Which the US expects to be loyal, like France, are expressing doubts that the United States is a reliable partner, and are beginning to shift towards the East. What we see as a result is a desperate attempt by the US and its staunchest allies to weaken its economic adversaries by encouraging proxy wars in Eastern Europe and Asia. So far, China has not taken the bait, and instead has stepped into its role as a key negotiator, recently securing peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, contributing greatly to ending the war in Yemen, and now, with any luck, helping to peacefully resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It has become increasingly apparent that as the US empire declines, it will become ever more violent and militaristic, a dangerous situation for the rest of the world, as the United States remains the only country on Earth to have used nuclear weapons on human beings. And they did it not once, but twice. The Communist Party of the United States, and the masses of people both here and around the world, must call
are totally ineffective, sitting around in a massive circle jerk, making stupid videos like this instead of actually understanding the world.
Unanimously for an end to US involvement not just in Ukraine, but in the South China Sea.
Oh, so you're advocating the slaughter of the Philippines and Ukraine. Excellent.
In Africa, in Latin America, and everywhere the US war machine has extended its tendrils. We must unequivocally say no to US involvement and no to imperialist war, always. Enough blood has been spilled desperately trying to maintain an economic order that does not serve the people. Capitalism and imperialism remain the greatest evils of our time. And if we are to secure a better future for all of us, it must be dismantled. And we can start by demanding a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine.
None of that is even remotely close to true. So this gets back into what I was talking about previously. Leftists need to really begin to engage with foreign policy in a realistic manner. No, he needs to just delete his channel. Jesus Christ. Yeah, I'm gonna go find something else in my recommended that we can watch, because I want to try to at least pump an hour and a half out of this. But, holy shit. Look, understanding foreign policy and foreign relations is not beneath you as a leftist. Because guess what? Countries aren't going anywhere anytime soon. There may be a glorious day when nation states no longer exist and everyone is sitting around singing the Internationale and it's a good old-fashioned time. But that is not going to be any time within the next 50, 60 years. You will have to reckon with the fact that nations exist, governments exist. You have to be able to create policy, and you can't just sit around in a circle jerk and pretend it's not a thing. Got the pause, hang on. See what has people done? Actually, that's not what we're going to watch, but give me a second.
Gods and Generals is the most offensive Civil War movie since...
That's also correct, but not what we're going to watch. All right, I just struggle to see why tank is simp for the USSR and Russia, because they don't actually understand what they're talking about. They never learned history, and they never learned political science in any real sense. So what ends up happening is they sit around and they read self-reinforcing theory by each other, and they're never forced to engage with the concept that things did not appear the way the USSR or China or North Korea or Cuba said it did. So they never engage with that concept, and then they sit around and they pretend like X, Y, and Z is a good example of communism, and so they never have to engage with the reality of the Soviet Union, which deports mass amounts of people throughout the course of its history, effectively uprooting them from their homes in order to Russify the area and destroy the local culture. They never have to really reckon with China's great leap forward and how many Chinese people were killed. They don't have to reckon with the Khmer Rouge. They don't have to reckon with any of these things because they never learn about them and they never put them in the context. And like there's a legitimate thing. There's a legitimate difference between wanting a better world and thinking that it's already there. And tankies think that that world's already there, that they're working towards it. And it's a delusion, but it's a very seductive delusion, right? If you've never seen the movie Gettysburg, you're missing out. It's actually excellent. However, this is a series that Attun-Shei did about improving it, and I'm just going to make comments about the movie as we go along because I love the movie too.
Gettysburg is a pretty good movie, and I'm going to spend the next 3 days shitting on it. Now look, I understand this movie has a special place in the hearts of many, many people, and if you love it, just know I'm not trying to take that away from you. This series will be less of a takedown and more of a dissection, taking out each of Gettysburg's organs one by one, examining what works and what doesn't. Like, I don't hate this movie. It doesn't make my skin crawl. There are some things about it that I absolutely love, and other things that, well, not so much.
We should have freed the slaves, then fired on Fort Sumter.
And while it's fun to tear a bad movie to pieces, gleefully nitpicking the historical inaccuracies and loudly decrying it as the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone ever, it can be way more constructive to examine the strengths and weaknesses of a deeply flawed classic, and offer up humble suggestions about how it maybe could have been done better. We'll also be exploring the history behind the Battle of Gettysburg. The film tries to cover every Civil War-related topic imaginable throughout its mammoth runtime, but it also paints an incomplete and somewhat misleading picture of history, trivializing the momentous and complicating the obvious. To be clear, Gettysburg gets a lot right, and if you don't know too much about this battle, you'll glean a lot of good information from watching the movie. But Gettysburg and the Killer Angels, the novel is based on, are so well regarded, so universally praised for their painstaking attention to historical detail, and so fucking popular among the toxic Civil War fandom, that the way that it presents events is kind of the way that we look at the Battle of Gettysburg now. People with advanced degrees use the pretentious word historiography to refer to this change in perspective. The study of historiography is the study.
Historiography is not a pretentious word, but it is, I think, a vital thing to talk about in terms of Gettysburg and how we have shifted some of our understanding of history in the meantime.
Of how people's perception of historical events changes over time.
The
This can be influenced by changing cultural values, stories, politics, religion, anything really. So when I bitch and moan about inaccuracies and omissions that literally no well-adjusted person would ever give a shit about, just know that it's because I don't entirely agree with the historiography that Gettysburg presents. And more importantly, it's just an excuse to share some pretty interesting history with people on the internet. And if you're not a well-adjusted person, hello, brother, then chances are you know most of this shit already. Okay, let's gut this sacred cow. Nothing like Gettysburg will ever be made again. Originally filmed as a miniseries, then released theatrically by New Line Cinema, Gettysburg is a relic from before the golden age of television. Nowadays, some of the best entertainment out there comes from film and TV shows. But many of you may remember that back in the 80s and 90s, TV movies and limited series were almost always garbage.
I will get you! Where are you?
They were low-budget, low-risk productions, conceived to make a quick buck. Very much like the pulpy D movies you find.
So, I don't know if anyone remembers old Netflix before it got big, right after they transitioned from, CDs. Yeah, the game audio will go down in a minute. It was just playing a thing. Right after they transitioned from sending things to you in the mail to full streaming. But they used to have the D-movie version of every major movie that came out. It was kind of hilarious. So, like, the movie Battleship came out, and it would have a movie called Warship, or something along those lines. Gettysburg is, like, the last war film that's really produced in a highly technical way. Like, not green screened half to death, and it really shows.
During deep dives on streaming services. I think the main difference between Gettysburg and the mountains of televised trash from the same era is that director Ron Maxwell and producer Ted Turner didn't really care about making money. They just cared deeply about history and wanted to do it justice. I firmly believe that art made for art's sake will always be better than art made for monetary gain. Well, maybe not necessarily better in quality, but certainly more noteworthy and interesting. Ron Maxwell made Gettysburg with a singular, determined vision, working with severely limited means, and against all odds, he delivered an instant classic.
It grabbed me on in the subconscious place first. The way a fine piece of music can grab you, and you don't know why, but you're captivated by it. What distinguishes the experience for me from other novels I may have read over the years is that I also felt, as I was reading it, a compulsion to tell the story on film.
How then do we reconcile Maxwell's crowning achievement with the undeniable fact that he's kind of a talentless hack? Maxwell's made 2 other Civil War films since Gettysburg. 2003's Gods and Generals is a tedious, self-important slog with a sinister agenda. 2013's Copperhead is an utter embarrassment, tarnished not only by inexplicable pacing and wooden performances, but also by technical incompetence.
Gods and Generals is awful.
Including bad audio and video quality that would barely be excusable in a $5,000 student film. Looking back at Gettysburg with the benefit of hindsight, you can certainly see the seeds of incompetence and tedium that would grow to tarnish Maxwell's career. But you can also look at Gods and Generals or Copperhead and still feel the historical passion, the artistic compulsion that inspired him to direct Gettysburg. I'm not a fan of Ron Maxwell, but I know he's not in it for money or recognition, and I respect him a lot for that. I guess Gettysburg was just a perfect storm. Lightning in a bottle, made by the right people at the right time. Ron, if you're watching, I would love to hear your personal insight about my criticism. Send me an email. I'll respectfully interview you for the benefit of our audiences, and we can exchange ideas. Oh, and Ron's publicist, if you're watching, urge him to never contact me under any circumstances.
I enjoy Attun-Shei. He is incredibly funny.
In an older Q&A video, I said that Ron Maxwell's movies lacked humanity. That's certainly true for Gods and Generals and Copperhead, but during my most recent rewatch, I realized that lumping Gettysburg into that criticism was monstrously unfair. A lot of the characters are pretty stiff, or feel more like cartoon characters than people, but Lord Almighty, this movie is filled to the brim with humanity.
I'll tell you lots. I sure was fond of that man. Yeah.
There are tons of moments like that. Just a look or a line that'll feel wonderfully genuine and real.
How are you, Lo? I'm fine, Dick.
I don't like how much Gettysburg focuses on generals and officers at the expense of common soldiers, but I do commend how the film humanizes these semi-legendary historical figures. There were nearly 200,000 men who fought at Gettysburg, most of them with their own...
Okay, I kind of get what he's saying from a perspective of who is being focused upon. And it's true that you can see works of later works, in particular of film, that came out of the tail end or in the middle of the prestige television period, that do an excellent job, but they have significantly more, they do an excellent job of covering the broader experience of a range of soldiers, right? But then they have the set of, like, it's a very, very confined story. So a good example of this is going to be something like Band of Brothers or The Pacific. Band of Brothers follows a single company, and it has a single point individual for each episode. That's the central individual that they follow for that episode. And so you get a cross-section of who is fighting in that unit in that war at that time. The Pacific follows 3 Marines in particular, one of them using the accounts he wrote, Eugene Sledge, using the account he wrote with the old breed on Guadalcanal. And like, those are really good works, but they don't capture the scope of the battle. And Attun-Shei will make a point later on that I think would make for an excellent movie, particularly with Jeff Daniels. I don't know if you've noticed me on Twitter. I'm very fond of Jeff Daniels shouting bayonets as a gif, but and I absolutely love that particular story for Chamberlain. But I don't think, no matter what you do for Gettysburg, you'd have to do compromises. And the compromises that were attuned for this movie and picked for this movie were appropriate for the scope of what happened at Gettysburg. It's the largest land battle ever fought in North American soil, and they somehow capture a significant portion of that. Not all of it, and that's a lot of what we're about to talk about. But I don't necessarily think a movie about Gettysburg can avoid focusing on the higher order officers.
Fascinating and pulse-pounding stories. But when creating historical fiction about this event, by necessity, you have to make some pretty tough decisions about whose perspectives you want to focus on. But at the same time, if you're billing your movie as a meticulously accurate representation of a historical event, you can unintentionally overemphasize the importance of the characters that you do decide to show. Nowhere is this more evident than the sequence depicting the fighting on the first day of the battle, July 1st, 1863. All we see of the first day is Union Cavalry General John Buford holding off Heath's division of Confederate infantry. That's a little strange, because it's not even close to the full story. One thing the movie gets right is how the Battle of Gettysburg got started pretty much by accident. Nobody had planned to fight there. Two infantry brigades got tangled into a fight with Buford's division of cavalry on McPherson's Ridge, just west of the town of Gettysburg. According to Buford himself, Confederate troops held the advantage of numbers, but Union troops had the advantage of position. The
Hurry up. If you want to do this, be my guest. But this ain't a job you want to rush.
That do it?
Signal's good! Arm the other detonators and pull back to me!
Come on, tough guy, we gotta blow this bridge. Dutch, arm the other charges.
What about those rays?
Forget about them, we got explosives to set. Follow me, arm the charges. Oh no!
cavalry held their own, but inflicted relatively few casualties. The real carnage of that day was yet to come. At around 10 a.m., after 2 hours of combat, Buford sent an urgent message to General George Gordon Meade, an old snapping turtle who held overall command of the Army of the Potomac.
The enemy's force are advancing on me at this point and driving my pickets and skirmishers very rapidly. I'm sure that the whole of A.P. Hill's Corps is advancing.
As the movie shows, General John Reynolds, commander of the 1st Corps of Union Infantry, then hastened to Gettysburg to support Buford's holding action. Hi, Reynolds! July 1st wasn't a skirmish between a handful of brigades. It was a full-fledged fucking battle. And while Buford, I'm sure, was a great guy and was good at his job, it's important to recognize...
Yes, but Buford is played by what's-his-face, who played, Avatar, Colonel Quattridge. So we have to follow him because he costs significantly more than the guy playing Buford.
That he didn't do all that much by himself to delay the rebel advance. Thankfully, 2 brigades of United States infantry arrived shortly after their corps commander to relieve Buford. They met with early success, driving Heath's men back and capturing a bunch of prisoners. Then Reynolds got shot in the head. Bye, Reynolds. That's pretty much all the movie in the book shows us of fighting on the first day. And that'd be fine if this movie was called Buford, but it's called Gettysburg, and it reports itself as a dramatization of more or less the whole battle. Now, this criticism stems more from my personal taste than anything else, but why focus on Buford when the subsequent events on the first day were so fucking metal? Remember these guys from the movie? The ones with the hats? Well, they just appear in this one shot and we never see them again, but those are men of Meredith's Iron Brigade. The Iron Brigade were some of the biggest badasses in the entire Army of the Potomac, easily distinguished by their bitchin' black hats. Upon their arrival on the field, they successfully overwhelmed General James Archer's brigade of Confederate infantry and took 100 prisoners, including Archer himself. Meanwhile, Joseph Davis's Confederate brigade was wiping the floor with the Yankees under Lysander Cutler, sending him running. A panicked moment ensued as the Union right folded, allowing Davis to flank the Iron Brigade. But 3 Union regiments counterattacked, suffering horribly from musket fire, before finally charging into brutal hand-to-hand fighting at a deep railroad cut near the Chambersburg Pike. Despite suffering nearly a...
That would have been Much cooler sequence.
50% casualty rate, United States forces successfully repelled the Confederate attack. Thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes, commanding the 6th Wisconsin, a 9th Brigade regiment, compelled 200 Mississippians to lay down their arms and surrender. Dawes later attributed his success to the enlisted men.
The rebel Karl can be seen waving defiantly just above the edge of the railroad cut. Corporal Eggleston, Company H, mere boy, sprang forward since he's been shot dead. Private Anderson and his company, furiously killing his brigade. Swung aloft his musket, and with a terrific blow, flipped the skull of the rebel shotgun. Into this deadly melee rushed Corporal Francis A. Waller, who seized and held the rebel battle flag. His name will remain upon the historic record, as he received from Congress a medal for this deed.
Harrowing stuff, dude. Mad respect. At midday, there was a lull in the fighting. The main bulk of both armies rushed toward Gettysburg to reinforce the battered units already engaged. The Army of Northern Virginia was arriving in Gettysburg in force at this point, and Lee wasn't about to let some hack frauds from Wisconsin block his way to Washington. Enough Confederates were arriving at the field by 2 p.m. that they handily outnumbered the Union defenders, so they attacked, ruthlessly. It was around then that the Constable of Gettysburg, a curmudgeonly 69-year-old War of 1812 veteran named John Burns, picked up his ancient flintlock rifle and went off to McPherson's Ridge to shoot some Rebs. He fought alongside United States troops for hours, suffering gunshot wounds.
There is a fairly legitimate point to be made about the movie Gettysburg, wherein the movie in and of itself, it's very bloodless. Like, a lot of people play die, because they're all reenactors they used to film this movie, and they didn't want to break their very expensive uniforms. So a lot of people play die, but not that many people. It does not convey the carnage very well.
Wounds in his arm, leg, and torso. After the battle, Burns became a national hero, and President Lincoln met with him personally during his famous visit to Gettysburg that November. And like any true American hero, Burns immediately capitalized on his fame. He changed the details of his story every time he told it, and blatantly lied about the extent of his War of 1812 service. But an inspiring, semi-true story about an old man is about all the United States forces got out of the battle. All afternoon, Confederate troops under Corps Commanders A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell slowly but surely chipped away at the Federal line. A division led by Stephen Lewis smashed Federal reinforcements of the 11th Corps under Oliver Howard, sending the Yankees scurrying to Cemetery Ridge, and allowing rebels in Ewell's Corps to strike at the rear of the main Union line. Abner Doubleday, Reynolds' successor to command, then ordered a retreat. The United States forces withdrew through the streets of Gettysburg to the south. And by 4:30 p.m., all their former positions to the north and west of town were now firmly in Confederate hands. And there are a million cool stories from this part of the battle that I would love to share with you, but there is no time for that. I do want to share with you, though, one quote from Alan Redwood, who fought at Gettysburg with the 55th Virginia Infantry, to give you an idea of what the day's fighting was like from the point of view of a regular enlisted soldier.
Once engaged, the soldier's attention is too much taken up with delivering his fire effectively to give heed to much else. It is hard work and hot work, in the literal, no less than the figurative sense, and extremely dirty work withal. The lips become caked with powder ground from biting the twist of the cartridges, and after 1 or 2 rounds the hands are blackened, smeared from handling the rammer. The sweat streams down and has to be cleared from the eyes in order to see the sights of the rifle, and the grime is transferred from hands to face. The line soon loses all semblance of regular formation. The companies have become merely groups of men, loading and firing and taking advantage of any accident aground. Natural depression, tree, rock, even a pile of fence rails that'll give protection.
Fuck, man. Where was that kind of shit in the movie? I really wish we had gotten...
The movie was rated PG-13.
more kind of intimate and personal and intense scenes with the average soldiers, you know? Young kids just loading their muskets over and over and trying desperately not to die. I mean, the only Confederate soldier we see who isn't an insufferable, effeminate aristocrat is the fighting for my rats guy.
For you what?
That seems like a pretty big oversight, glossing over the poor white Southern perspective like that.
Fighting for my rights.
The only information we get from him is a reassurance that he's not fighting for slavery.
I don't know about some other folk, but I ain't fighting for no darkies one way or the other.
Oh, thank goodness. I can root for him now, and don't have to give any thought at all to uncomfortable...
Yeah, this movie avoids talking about the particular issues behind the war pretty effectively. However, it does not necessarily avoid not being racist.
Truths about the foundational beliefs of the Confederacy. All the other Johnny Rebs are either extras or glorified extras, and they're just there to salivate over General Lee. I know he was loved, truly loved by his men, but not universally. A lot of Confederate soldiers were conscripts and didn't give a damn about the cause. Even those who did were infamous for holding their high command in utter contempt. I swear, Sam Watkins spends about half the company age bitching about officers. There's a great little story from the third year that demonstrates exactly what I'm talking about. In the afternoon of July 1st, Private Elijah Reed of the 2nd Division was wounded, captured by the enemy, and spent the rest of the battle as a hospitalized prisoner in the Lutheran Theological Seminary. Reed watched Pickett's charge unfold from the cupola of the seminary. Later, he observed a Confederate lieutenant launch into a vigorous rant, calling Lee a fool, and all the adverbs and adjectives qualifying the word fool. He claims that the Confederate then said, "Lee can't do it. He knows he can't do it. Then why in the hell does he try it?"
Frankly, I would watch a movie about people complaining about Robert E. Lee, who is so fucking overrated it's not even funny, all day.
See Buford criticizing the ineptitude of federal high command.
Men in tall hats and gold watch fobs will thump their chests and say what a brave charge it was.
Why isn't there a similar scene on the rebel side? I'd rather watch a movie about a vulgar, disillusioned Confederate than a bootlicking, Lee-loving Confederate any day. Of course, both exist, but the former just seems way more interesting to me. And why is the one black guy in this movie a skilled slave? Instead of one of the 5,000 free people of color who lived in the counties that the Confederate Army ran pages on.
This army will conduct itself properly and with respect to all civilian population at all times.
You might want to tell that to Jenkins' brigade of cavalry, who kidnapped hundreds of free black people in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, they cover the cavalry actions around Gettysburg, which were particularly brutal in the hands of the Confederates. Not at all. The Confederates, this was an invasion of the Union at this point, and they raided up and down, capturing black Americans and taking them into slavery. It was a particularly appalling set of actions of raiding.
And sold them into slavery back home. You might also want to tell that to yourself, since you were almost certainly aware of what was going on and just turned a blind eye. Definitely tell that to Longstreet, whose staff officer sent an order to George Pickett on July 1st, telling him to bring along his captured contraband as he marched his division to Gettysburg. You could easily make a whole movie about how Confederate cavalrymen forced their way into children's homes, carried off women and children, or how they castrated their hands during the retreat south, or how they chased down innocent people on horseback into the fields of Franklin County just to make some easy money. God, I so glad he did. One of Ron Maxwell's biggest problems is his tendency to gloss over the more complex and uglier aspects of Civil War history, instead opting for a more comforting and relatable portrayal of these flawed historical figures.
More phantoms look sharp!
Tell me something, Buster. What do you think?
We're doomed!
Reloading.
Well, if you mean the race. Any by the you seen them each other. I haven't known that many but those I do with anger, or
Don't nobody cross my
in the
street.
eye. That was a mother. That's all there is to it.
Everyone get inside the building!
I could totally understand finishing the book The Killer Angels and thinking, fuck, this would make a great movie. And it seems almost sacrilegious to make big changes to such a powerful piece of fiction. But that said, film and literature are very different art forms, and the things that make for great literature don't necessarily make for very compelling cinema. I think that's very much the case with the film adaptation of The Killer Angels, the 1993 film Gettysburg. In all his Civil War movies, director Ron Maxwell completely disregards traditional story structure, so he can pack as much history into his films as he possibly can. And I'm sure that's completely intentional. I suspect he cares much more about getting the history right than adhering to the rules of visual storytelling. In his mind, that's a bold artistic choice. But that doesn't work for me. As far as I'm concerned, if you're going to throw away a millennia-old tradition of visual storytelling dating back to ancient Greek theater, then you need to develop an original and unconventional aesthetic to match your original and unconventional approach to the narrative. I watch Gettysburg and I see a disappointing lack of creativity in the cinematography and editing. Camera angles are flat, and the blocking feels very staged. During battles, you don't get any sense at all of the ferocity and unpredictability of a real combat situation. And in dialogue scenes, the filmmaking is bland and unadventurous. Wide master shots, singles, shot reverse shot. There's just not that much going on. And that's fine. Not everything is to reinvent the wheel. But I think it's very telling. It says something about Ron Maxwell's approach to his work. When he makes a choice that's just inexplicable and bad, he's being bold and transgressive. But in just about every other way, his artistic choices are by the numbers, seen it 4,000 times, boring. Now, you might very well say that real life doesn't conform to story structure. Showing the complete sequence of events at the Battle of Gettysburg necessitates doing away with it. But the thing is, neither the book nor the film come even close to telling the whole story of the battle. Fuck, you'd be hard-pressed to do that over a 12-hour season of television. However, Gettysburg still bites off way more than it should, to the detriment of the narrative. Not just in regards to telling the story of the battle itself, but also in its attempts to reveal the beliefs of the soldiers involved, and to tell us about the causes for which they're fighting. They should have narrowed the scope of the book when writing the screenplay of the movie. Every minute spent dwelling on the larger political issues of the Civil War.
Yeah, the other problem with this is they didn't really dwell on the larger political issues of the Civil War. It was, oh, sorry, guys. It was a very, it was very tepid and very borderline lost cause-y.
War is a minute that could have been better used telling more awesome stories from the Battle of Gettysburg itself. But I hear you thinking, they did narrow the story. Like you said yesterday, of all the incredible stories from the Battle of Gettysburg, they only chose to focus on Buford's story, and Chamberlain's, and Lee's, and Longstreet's, and Hancock's, and Armistead's, and Pickett's, and this guy's. With almost 200,000 stories to choose from, that's a pretty short list. True, but I'm arguing that they didn't go far enough. Gettysburg should have been about a regiment, a single one. And of that regiment, most of our characters are a single company. Just young kids trying to make it through the battle of Gettysburg. You could make a 3-hour movie just about that. And in the film's portrayal of the second day of the battle, you can see glimpses of the laser-focused, airtight masterpiece that Gettysburg could have been. The decision to show the events of this day's fighting almost entirely from Chamberlain's perspective was an excellent one. And in my opinion, these scenes are by far the best in the movie. But we'll get more into that later. First, some historical context. So by dawn of the second day, both the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia were drawn up into the positions they would more or less occupy for the rest of the battle. General Meade, who, if you'll remember, shows up for...
Okay. We're going to talk about this in some detail in a later thing, but this is a very good example right here, the Union position, of what is called in military science having a internal ground line of communication. It's basically here. You can go from here to here very easily. Anywhere inside my lines here, the Union could go easily. External lines would be what the Confederates have. They have to go all the way around to reinforce a particular point. Not that this is particularly irrelevant to this thing, I just want to point it out, because I'm a nerd like that.
Positions they would more or less occupy for the rest of the battle. General Meade, who, if you'll remember, shows up for 90 seconds in the movie and is never seen again, adopted the famous fishhook formation, which was Federals well entrenched on high ground, especially at the flanks. At this point, Robert E. Lee was pretty pissed at General Ewell for not taking the strategic heights on Culp's Hill on the first day, despite the fact that Lee's orders to him were confusing and contradictory. Take the hill if practicable, but do not bring on a general engagement. Sounds a whole lot like "don't take the hill" to me, but and I get what Lee was trying to say, but it's hard to blame Ewell too much here. And I mean, that's it from Lee's end too. Neither army had a plan going into the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Confederate High Command had basically no intelligence about United States positions. So maybe we shouldn't judge Lee too harshly either.
Actually, that's an excellent question while I've got you all here. 1 second. I gotta type a poll. Apparently I didn't spell that nearly close to right.
Despite the Union defeat on July 1st, Meade had successfully outmaneuvered Lee, but it wasn't too late for the Confederates to turn it around. The Federals had a good position, and they would likely be hesitant to abandon it. So theoretically, the Confederates could just avoid battle altogether, go clear around Meade's army, and continue their march toward Washington. As the movie shows, Longstreet repeatedly urged Lee to disengage with the enemy and find more advantageous ground elsewhere, but Lee insisted on an immediate attack. This is actually one aspect of the Killer Angels historiography that I like, namely, the rehabilitation of James Longstreet. After the war, Longstreet infamously joined the Republican Party and advocated for cooperation with the federal forces that occupied the South during Reconstruction. It wasn't exactly a change of heart. At the end of the day, Longstreet wanted what most ex-Confederates wanted, namely, return to the antebellum status quo, and black Southerners for the benefit of rich white Southerners.
You should have freed the slaves, then fired in Fort Sumter.
Right? But while most Southern Democrats used terror and violence to achieve these ends, Longstreet preferred a more rebellion. He believed that by cooperating with the Federals, ex-Confederates could infiltrate the Republican Party, control the African American South, and use it for their own ends. But no matter his intentions, Longstreet collaborating with the enemy, to say nothing of vocally criticizing Lee's leadership during the war, did not exactly endear him to his former comrades. In the early 1870s, Jubal Early began claiming that on the night of July...
So Longstreet is almost assuredly the best Confederate commander, which isn't saying much, because they lost. But he is definitely the most maligned Confederate commander as well. Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good thing to start working on because they're shorter, easier videos.
July 1st at Gettysburg, Lee had told Ewell, Early, and Robert Rhodes that Longstreet was under strict orders to attack at dawn on the 7th. Longstreet didn't attack until which Early claimed was culpable. This was a total lie. Lee didn't decide on the battle plan until the 2nd. He didn't even know for sure where the Federal left flank ended until Longstreet's attack had already commenced. The two other witnesses to this imaginary conversation, Rhodes and Ewell, were conveniently dead. So it was Early's word against Longstreet. And as far as most white Southerners were concerned, Longstreet was a filthy scoundrel. So blame for the Confederate loss of Gettysburg landed squarely on his shoulders. I don't think Longstreet was like an amazing fighter, but 100 years of unjust blame for the biggest missed opportunity in American military history, that's harsh. Had Lee been alive when Early was slandering Longstreet, I'm pretty sure he would have come to the defense of his old war horse and accepted full responsibility for the defeat. That's just the kind of man he was. But who's to say? Anyway, the fighting on July 2nd began when General Dan the Man Sickles, commanding the Union 3rd Corps, sent a reconnaissance force of elite sharpshooters under Hiram Dan to scope out the Confederate positions. The sharpshooters encountered Confederates massing in force in Pitzer's Woods, about a half-mile west of the Union line. Sickles, deciding that his current position was untenable for defense, decided to move his whole corps forward into a place called the Peach Orchard, which offered some higher ground.
Get that letter to your family.
In the process, he opened up huge fucking gaps in the Union line.
Everyone on the elevator.
A mistake that
I put enough
Longstreet
charges in this shaft to blow this building
exploited.
twice.
This tasty snack, Porter Alexander, opened up an artillery barrage on Sickles' own batteries, and Confederate infantry swarmed in for the kill. Understandably, Meade was pissed, but considering the combat was already underway, he ordered Sickles to defend his new position, and brought up reserves of 5th Corps infantry to plug the holes in the line. After Meade's review of the 3rd Corps,
yeah, they didn't focus much on any of this for the second day in the movie itself, and they focused almost entirely on Chamberlain, which they'll talk about extensively here in a minute. But this was incredibly brutal fighting.
General Warren, the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac, rode up to Little Round Top and found it unoccupied by troops from either side. He immediately recognized the strategic significance of the hill and diverted two 5th Corps brigades under Colonel Strong Vincent and General Stephen Weed to set up a defensive line on the summit. As Meade and Warren shifted troops around, Longstreet and Sickles continued to batter one another, with scenes of unimaginable carnage at places like Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, and the aptly named Floyd. At around 4:30 p.m., General John Bell Hood, a division of Confederates on Longstreet's far right, was severely wounded. Command of his division passed to one General Evander Law. Law, by all accounts, did not properly coordinate the rest of the attack, which was sloppy and rudderless. He had also failed to appoint a successor for his old brigade, which was now leaderless and marching right into Weed and Vincent's positions on Little.
As a rule, you really should establish who takes over when you get shot as a combat commander. It's good policy.
Round Top. This is where the movie starts showing us the events of the second day. We see Colonel Vincent impress upon Chamberlain the importance of the Union left, followed by the 20th Maine's dust-up with the 15th Alabama. I love this scene, mainly because it's the only battle sequence in the movie told entirely from the perspective of characters I give a shit about. I like Armistead and Longstreet just fine as characters, but the only characters I love are Lawrence and Their scenes feel the most cinematically compelling, by which I mean their arcs form a cohesive story. We get to know them.
Jonathan, don't call me Lawrence.
Root for them when they're in danger, and watch them grow and change. Moments like this.
That's also like a much better moment in the movie because he talks to those two individual soldiers about holding, about their accuracy previously. So like, the point that gets made later on in this video series about the 54th, not 54th, about Chamberlain's unit is I think a very valid one, and that it is a cohesive arc. However, it's also not the critical point of the second day of Gettysburg. Like, it's not the most important fighting.
Are genuinely tense and exciting. Not because they're exceptionally well shot or anything, but because you actually give a shit about the fates of these characters. A lot of that comes from the book, but the performances really drive it home. Making a film on a lower budget kind of forces you to focus on character development rather than spectacle. Gettysburg was made for $20 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's $36 million in today's money. So, tense. And Gettysburg does sort of feel like a historical household that constructed. And I actually love that about it. I wish that all the battles had this kind of emphasis on character development. Most of the battles in Gettysburg exist in a weird vacuum, completely separate from the plot of the movie. They don't feature characters we know or care about. The fighting on the first and much of the second day is shown with bizarre cutaways to pudgy reenactors exchanging pot shots. The most baffling of these cutaways is the representation of the fighting at Devil's Den, where we see a few Billy Yanks trying their best not to slip on the rocks in their brogans. Why did this shot make it into the movie? Aren't these guys like fighting in a war? Wouldn't they be hurtling themselves off this rock to escape from the advancing enemy? I mean, fuck, I'd rather break a leg, even knowing it'll probably get sent off. I let myself fall into the hands of these filthy rebs. There's just no urgency at all here. No stakes, no emotional investment. I like Sam Elliott just fine, but I could give two shits about General Buford. I don't know the guy. He shows up, growls out some cynical dialogue. I certainly don't care about John Reynolds. Hi, Reynolds. Bye, Reynolds. I really only have one criticism of the Little Round Top scene, and it's mostly pedantic. Namely that, like Buford, I think the movie accidentally overemphasizes the 20th Maine's importance.
20th Maine
They weren't that crucial to the Union victory, and yet that's a common misconception that a lot of people have. Now, I'm not necessarily trying to knock Chamberlain here. He fought well, and the bayonet charge was fucking dope. He deserved the Medal of Honor for that. But I do strenuously object to the idea that the 20th Maine single-handedly saved the entire Army of the Potomac from certain destruction. The thing is, this whole stretch of the Union left was under an incredible amount of pressure. The Confederate attack on Little Round Top was tenacious, and just because the slope in front of...
So, it is accurate to say that the 20th Maine is perhaps overemphasized compared to the whole stretch of fighting that day. It is not accurate to say that had they not held the hill in question, that the Union would have survived. Had the Confederates been able to circle around Little Round Top, they would have been able to take the whole Union line and roll it up, right up. So it's not that it's not important. I don't necessarily agree with that assessment.
Vincent and Weed's commands was rocky and steep, as opposed to the more gently rolling section that Chamberlain defended, doesn't mean that they had it much easier. I think the main reason that Chamberlain is a household name today, while Vincent and Weed are mere historical footnotes, is because Vincent and Weed died that day. Well, they didn't die. They got mortally wounded and then died later, but whatever. Poor General Weed, dead in a purplish haze of gunsmoke, his eyes slowly turning red with blood as he breathed his last. Oh, General Weed, we shall smoke our pipes continuously in your
I hear he died at 4:20 in the afternoon.
loving memory. But Chamberlain did a lot more to secure his place in American history than just to survive. He also wrote prolifically and spoke about his wartime experiences publicly on many occasions. He had a wildly successful career after the Civil War, being governor of Maine and president of Bowdoin College. Artist James Kelly claimed that General Oliver Howard once told him, speaking of Chamberlain,
We never thought Chamberlain would amount to anything. He got married and became a teacher and did very well. He then went to the war and we said, now he will fail. But he became, before the war ended, a very good soldier. After the war, he became president of Bowdoin College and we said, now he will fail surely. But he became one of the best presidents the college ever had. Then he was made governor and we said, now he shall surely fail. But he wrote good messages and they elected him 3 terms.
and even now, 100 years after his death, his reputation doesn't.
Man, think about how much people expect you to fail. Like, everything you do, you're going to fail, and then you overcome it. Like, come on, that deserves a little bit of credit. Dude won the Medal of Honor.
Have a scratch on it. And it's not entirely due to the movie, but it sure didn't hurt either. And thanks in part to him, as well as many other officers and men in the Army of the Potomac, the Federal line would hold against Longstreet's attack on the second day. But the action on the Union left is only half the tale. On the Union right, A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell's corps were also hotly engaged that day, trying their damnedest to dislodge the Yankees from their defensive positions on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge. On Cemetery Ridge, a disjointed defensive line of men from General Winfield Hancock's 2nd Corps faced a fucking terrifying attack from a horde of Rebs. Well, not a horde exactly, but about a division and a half of Confederate infantry. The Yankees had insufficient numbers here to mount effective defense. Meade had sent most of the reserves that he had on hand to reinforce the left flank. The Confederates marched implacably forward, and Cadmus Wilcox's brigade broke through the Union lines at the Emmitsburg Road. In a panic, Hancock grabbed the first unengaged Union force he could find and ordered them to plug the gap. This force was the 1st Minnesota Infantry. Hancock ordered them to charge Wilcox's line without delay. Let me make sure you understand exactly what's going on here. Hancock was commanding his understrength regiment, 263 men, to bayonet charge a brigade of 1,700 men. They knew they were going to their deaths. They knew that what was expected of them was to sacrifice themselves, to buy Hancock a little bit of time. But they went anyway, without hesitation. The 1st Minnesota fixed bayonets and hurtled themselves at the enemy under heavy fire. In some Ride of the Rohirrim type shit, they fucking shattered Wilcox's line and fought alone until a regiment of New Yorkers was able to come up and support them. Wilcox called for reinforcements too, but none came. The Minnesotans halted the momentum of his attack. The fight lasted for about 15 minutes. In that time, the 1st Minnesota suffered an 82% casualty rate. Why wasn't that in the movie? Why didn't we get to see these men charging headlong into overwhelming odds, shattering slavers' skulls with every swing of their stainless steel testicles? Meanwhile, at the extreme right of the Union fishhook, Ewell was discovering that taking Culp's Hill was by no means...
Because again, PG-13. This movie is, with its extended edition, about 4.5 hours long, by the way. Like, it's not a short movie. It also is way much longer than would ever be made today.
Practicable. Lee had ordered him to attack at 3 p.m. to draw Federal troops away from Longstreet's main attack on the Union left. But Ewell didn't hear the thunder of Longstreet and Hill's artillery until 4 p.m., and only then ordered a bombardment of United States positions. Ewell kept up artillery fire for 3 hours, before finally committing his infantry at 7 p.m., pretty close to sundown. By this time, Longstreet's assault had already lost momentum, so the attack on Culp's Hill completely failed to enact Lee's strategy. But considering the odds that they were up against, these entrenched Yankees in very strong defensive positions. Really can't help but marvel at how brave these Confederate soldiers were. At one point, General George Stuart's brigade overran Federal defenses and seized control of their breastworks, but failed to capitalize on their victory. Unfortunately for Stuart, he had no idea that unguarded Union supply trains were massed on the Baltimore Pike only a few hundred yards away from him. If Stuart had pressed his attack just a little bit further, he would have struck a tremendous blow to the Army of the Potomac. At 10 p.m., the fighting finally died down. Stuart still occupied part of the hill, but most Confederates were repulsed. The situation was confused and uncertain in the dark, though it was clear that the carnage would continue in the morning. Here's a tip for all you indie filmmakers out there. If you want to make a Gettysburg movie on the cheap, set it on Culp's Hill on the evening of the second day. In the dark, you can make 40 extras look like 200, and the little flashes of musketry in the dark would be, pretty cool little visual thing. I give this idea to you for free. Give me a story credit or something. And again, there are about 1 million stories, and I'm just glossing over them. I'd love to tell you about Wesley Bolton, who was born in Gettysburg and then moved to Virginia, joined the Confederate Army, and according to legend, died trying to take the very hill that bore his family name. But there is no time for that. There is no time. The second day of battle ended in defeat for the Confederates, though it was an incredibly near thing.
I nearly broke. I could feel them breaking.
They might have broke, but it's pretty unlikely. Also, Martin Sheen is fantastic in this movie.
And there for a moment I thought I saw our flags go up the hill.
This might be a controversial opinion, but I actually really like Martin Sheen as Robert E. Lee. This might be my favorite depiction of Lee in all of historical fiction, with the possible exception of Harry Turtledove's Guns of the South. It's a super complex portrayal, and he's full of paradoxes. He's honorable and ruthless, restrained and deeply emotional, humble and arrogant. He isn't unjustly deified or unduly demonized. He's just a person who happens to be in command of 70,000 men. The scene where Lee chews out Jeb Stuart is another one that I really love. You get a wonderful sense of both these men's personalities, and Martin Sheen's acting is fucking dope here. I love how he's got this simmering anger that just explodes, but then he catches himself and turns his rebuke into constructive criticism. And that's an important life lesson. You're not going to change somebody's mind by yelling at them and cataloging their faults. No, you've got to try to see things from their perspective.
You aren't? Well, what are we supposed to do then as streamers? That's like basically our job.
That'll always be more constructive. And I know that's something that I could be better at, specifically when I criticize Ron Maxwell, but it's never too late to change. And I hope that I can, going forward, criticize with compassion rather than hatred. It is the opinion of some excellent Civil War buffs that you have let us all down.
Well, I think one of the fundamental obligations of a filmmaker is to be a truth teller.
There will be none of that. There is no time.
If you look at our,
let's not fight the hunter.
Our society,
shall we?
Our human
Yeah.
society.
There is no time. Mr.
I'm not
Maxwell,
a coward. You're a coward.
Your mission was to direct a quality prequel to the film Gettysburg. That mission was not fulfilled. Instead, you gave us Gods and Generals, which is as historically inaccurate as it is insufferably boring. You have reinforced lost cause historiography and propagated myths about the benevolence of slavery. So it is only by God's grace that you did not set the public.
Should we do more Civil War Southern accents? I like an entire stream done in Civil War Southern accents. Would that be a thing worth watching?
View of the Civil War back decades.
There's a pressure on artists, whether they be filmmakers or other kinds of storytellers, to conform to the adverse effects of political correctness.
Perhaps you misunderstood my order? Perhaps I did not make myself clear? Well, this, must be made very clear. You, with your movies, are considered an authority of Civil War history. When you make a shitty film and get your facts wrong, you do damage to historical education. That has already happened once. It must never, ever happen again.
Over the 25 or so years altogether that I was working on Gettysburg.
I have told you there is no time for that! There is no time!
I do declare, he is quite upset.
There are not enough Civil War films being made today. And we need you. Lord knows we need you. I know your quality. You are a smart man, and your service to historical cinema has been invaluable. You must take what I have told you and learn from it, as a man does. There has been a mistake. It will not happen again. Now, let us speak no more of it.
So I was actually popping around and looking at some music, and it turns out that Pete Seeger's, this is somewhat related, turns out that Pete Seeger's rendition of John Brown's Body is copyrighted. And I can't help but feel that Pete Seeger would object to Content ID flagging his song. Just feels like something Pete Seeger would object to. Alright. We are almost through the fun stuff.
In the previous 2 videos of this series, I've argued that the film Gettysburg would have benefited enormously from a much more focused and cohesive plot. I appreciate that Gettysburg has more educational value than most historical fiction films out there, but at the end of the day, education or dramatization is not the purpose of narrative filmmaking. Storytelling is. I get the sense that director Ron Maxwell and financier Ted Turner didn't just want to make any old Civil War movie. They wanted to make the greatest, longest, most lavish Civil War movie ever. But when you let ambition get in the way of telling a good story, I think you do yourself a disservice as a filmmaker. But I also understand that Ron Maxwell has a very different idea of what makes a good movie than I do. He seems very concerned with making films that are completely separate from the cultural or political winds of the day. I would argue that he fails at that with Gods and Generals, which presents a mythological version of the Civil War which has always been inherently political. I'd further argue that it's impossible to completely uncouple your work as an artist from the world around you. We are all products of our time, and it affects nearly every aspect of our lives. But with Gettysburg, Maxwell came as close as he ever did to achieving this goal. For all its imperfections, there is a timeless quality about it. I think Maxwell spends a lot of time thinking about his artistic philosophy, time that might be better spent thinking about how he wants to shoot or edit a scene.
Other filmmakers are into answering questions, and we need all kind of filmmakers. I believe my role as a filmmaker is to pose questions.
Okay, Ron, but where do you want us to put the camera?
It takes a kind of a surrender. What do I mean by that? I mean a surrender of the ego.
That's great, Ron, but what lens should we use for the shot?
Start with your compass. Some call it a moral compass. You call it an aesthetical compass.
I've never heard anyone ever refer to an aesthetic compass.
But
all right, Ron, but what's my character's objective in this scene?
You have to feel that you are the unique storyteller in the world to tell this story. It's got to be that much of an imperative.
Sure, Ron, but do you want this cut to begin here or 3 frames sooner? I would suggest that 30% of filmmaking is artistic and 70% is technical. And I don't think that Ron Maxwell...
And I'll be perfectly honest, there is a significant amount of even this streaming stuff that's incredibly technical. And not artistic framing. And let's be frank, we are not very good with technical stuff. Here. Go ahead, donate to our Patreon. Then we can learn how to do, we can pay people to teach us how to do things. That makes us look much more professional. There, I plugged to the Patreon today. I did my job.
Really appreciate
link in the description.
That there's a science to his art. And while Gettysburg is artistically timeless, it's technically very dated. Which brings us to Pickett's charge. I really don't like this scene. But then again, maybe we should back up a little bit. To the small hours of July the 3rd, 1863. At midnight, General Meade held a council of war in his headquarters. His corps commanders unanimously agreed that the army should retain its current position and not go on the offensive. At the meeting, Meade is said to have predicted that Lee would attack his center on the following day. But at first light, he was seemingly proven wrong when fighting once again erupted on Culp's Hill. Ewell's Corps renewed their assault 7 more times before finally being beaten back with heavy losses. Hundreds of trees were shattered in cannon and musket fire.
So I gotta ask you the problem. Are you a part of the problem or the whole problem? How much of your ambition is on display?
Throughout the battle, which lasted all morning. If you'll remember, Stuart's brigade of Confederate infantry the previous night had captured some key Union positions. During the morning's fighting, those positions were lost. Neither Longstreet nor Hill's corps were ready to attack yet. Once again, a lack of Confederate coordination had derailed Lee's plans, and now the Union right was stronger and better entrenched than ever. Confederate hopes for victory now hinged on one final, desperate gamble. Lee decided that after a massive artillery barrage, Longstreet would attack the Union center at Cemetery Ridge. Simultaneously, Jeb Stuart's cavalry would swing in from the east and strike Meade in the rear. Famously, Longstreet was very nervous about the idea, and the movie portrays this very well, with many scenes and moments lifted directly from Longstreet's memoirs.
Pickett said, "General, shall I advance?" The effort to speak the order failed, and I could only indicate it by an affirmative bow. He accepted the duty with seeming confidence of success, leaped on his horse, and rode gaily to command.
I also like how much suspense there is leading up to the charge. By the time the bombardment starts, I'm always really worked up. My blood's pumping. I'm ready for some action, and then...
General Armistead, sir! My compliments!
There are boys here from Norfolk, Portsmouth, small hamlets along James River.
This lead-up scenes, these lead-up scenes to the charge are interminably long, which is why the movie takes 4 hours, incidentally.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of these speeches. I'll be into what's happening in the movie, and then somebody will go on about the cause, and what it means to be American, and... oh god. Here we go. Armistead's monologue to Colonel Fremantle completely deflates the tension for me. We don't get any new information. It serves no purpose for the plot. He emphasizes how dangerous Pickett's charge will be, and how brave his men are, but we know that already. Longstreet and Lee have been talking about that for 45 minutes. The only speech I like is Chamberlain's one from the beginning, when he's trying to get the main mutineers back on side, mainly because the speech serves a function in the story. Chamberlain has an actual objective here, and his compassion toward these mutineers tells us a lot about who he is as a person. Many of the speeches are taken directly from the book, but in the book you understand what's going on in the characters' heads, and they just work better for me in that context. Again, just kind of a personal preference thing. For example, in Chamberlain's speech, Michael Shara describes how embarrassed he feels, how corny and hollow his own words sound to him, and eventually his emotion just takes over and he gets carried away, and so by the end he's speaking from the heart. Jeff Daniels does a wonderful job delivering this monologue, but I resent how the movie takes this complex moment and dumbs it down by slapping inspiring music over it.
No man born to royalty, here we judge you by what you do, not by who your father was.
The writing and the performance are good enough. I don't need a musical cue to tell me to feel inspired. I don't know, wouldn't it be classier if the score were just silent here? In any case, the frequent detours into pontification bring the plot to a grinding halt again and again, for no discernible reason. And it's a shame, because they're wonderfully performed. But the phrase, "kill your darlings," comes to mind. Most of the speeches could be left on the cutting room floor, and I think the movie would be better for it. For example, Armistead's speech, it's, fine, but it takes up precious time that could be used showing us more of that dope-ass artillery barrage. I know everybody loves this little moment from Hancock.
There are times when a corps commander's life does not count.
But I feel like this scene could be way more intense. Though most of the Confederate shells overshot the line, sometimes by miles.
Hey fellas, you notice how that Reb artillery always overshoot?
It was still the largest artillery barrage in the history of the continent, by God. My favorite first-hand account of
Yes, very much so.
this bombardment is by Lieutenant Frank Haskell, who was on Cemetery Ridge that afternoon.
We thought that at Second Bull Run, at Antietam, and at Fredericksburg on the 11th of December, we had heard heavy cannonading. They were but holiday salutes compared with this. Besides the great ceaseless roar of the guns, which was but the background of the others, a million various minor sounds engage the ear. The projectiles shriek long and sharp. They hiss, they scream, they growl, and they sputter. All sounds of life and rage, and each has its different note, and all are discordant. We saw a man coming up from the rear with his full knapsack on, and some canteens of water held by the straps in his hands. He was walking slowly and with apparent unconcern, though the iron hailed around him. A shot struck the knapsack, and it, and its contents, flew 30 yards in every direction, the knapsack disappearing like an egg, thrown spitefully against a rock. The soldier stopped and turned about in puzzled surprise, put up one hand to his back to assure himself that the knapsack was not there, and then walked slowly on again unharmed, not even with his coat torn.
That would have been a great moment to him.
So what I'm going to work on doing, actually, while we're talking about, is incorporating a lot more primary source accounts when we talk about events, particularly researched events. Because the Florida education stream was, I think, pretty well done, and I think you guys thought so too. And B, I think it gives us an opportunity to talk about issues, and to analyze sources, and to start sort of mapping out how to think like a historian and do analysis. And I think there can be a value in that, which is, let me know if you agree.
Include, but I understand that something like that probably would have been beyond Gettysburg's budget. Don't get me wrong, I am very, very impressed, legitimately, with how far the producers took that $20 million. But nonetheless, a lot of the battle scenes just feel kind of rushed and choppy. Like, they didn't get all the shots they wanted and had to salvage it in editing with mixed results. You'd think that a movie called Gettysburg would make an effort to produce some memorable battle scenes, but action sequences like the cannonade and Pickett's charge are really where the small budget starts to become a big problem. It seems clear to me that a conscious effort was made to emulate the battle scenes in Waterloo, but Waterloo feels more sure-handed to me. Literally! And I feel like there might be another missed opportunity here, specifically regarding East Cavalry Field. Around the same time the cannonade began, about 3 miles east of the main battlefield, Jeb Stuart's cavalry encountered a much smaller force of United States cavalry under General David Gregg. Stuart, being Stuart, ordered a dramatic charge to sweep aside the Federal skirmishers. So Gregg ordered this asshole, Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, to send forward one of the Michigan regiments under his command to counterattack. Custer, being Custer, led the attack himself, shouting to his men, "Come on, you Wolverines!" The two charges collided. It was like the old days. Guys on horses fucking butchering each other with swords. The 34th Virginia Cavalry, a murderous band.
Yikes. I've never gotten why Michiganders are called Wolverines.
Band of irregulars led by a beautifully psychotic bushwhacker named Colonel Vincent Witcher fought dismounted at the Rummel Farm at East Cavalry Field, fighting the Yankees hand-to-hand or at point-blank range. Witcher later wrote about the casualties that his regiment had sustained.
I shall never, no.
I also want to point out that if you read accounts of the Confederate cavalry during the Civil War, they're like the frickin' SS. They're brutal and murderous. How's everyone doing tonight? I'm doing okay. How are you doing, Vidalia?
I'll never forget that eventful night when, accompanied by one courier, my adjutant Edwards and Sergeant Major, both being wounded, I, full of grief and bitterness, rode to the barns in our rear and saw with tears in my eyes my brave fellows from away over the mountains in West Virginia laid out in windrows, torn and bleeding. I shall never forget that night or the next morning's parade when I could muster but 96 enlisted men. Brave fellows, not a slaveholder among them.
Eventually, Stuart's charge failed. He was unable to drive the Federals from the field, and the Union rear was secure from cavalry attack. This was by no means the most crucial part of the Battle of Gettysburg, and I don't blame Maxwell at all for not including it. But still, it would have been cool to do like a Return of the Jedi type thing, you know, where we cut between Pickett's charge and East Cavalry Field, and...
Return of the Jedi works really well. He's talking about the Battle of Endor sequence. Return of the Jedi works very well because there are 3 battles going on. You have Luke versus Vader in Palpatine's throne room in the Death Star. You have the Rebel fleet versus the Imperial fleet in orbit around the Death Star. And then you have the battle going on the forest moon of Endor. And the reason why the cuts between these work very well with very little comment is because each of these particular sequences takes place on a distinct location. And you know when you cut to the location that that's what's happening. In this particular context, I don't think that works because it's very difficult to figure out what one unit is from another if you have not done the legwork for them beforehand. So like you can cut to different fights going on at a particular time, but each time you're going to have to do that Captain America Civil War thing where you flash the location up on the screen, and that just drives people nuts.
And see the Confederate strategy slowly start to unravel. To the west, Lee was blissfully unaware that his plan for a hammer and anvil attack had died in its crib, and at about 3 p.m., the divisions of Johnston Pettigrew, Isaac Trimble, and George Pickett began marching deliberately towards Cemetery Ridge. Little did these men know that 130 years later, their courage and sacrifice would be immortalized in the form of what's, in my opinion, one of the crappiest battle scenes ever. I think the Pickett's charge scene is just awful. I'd go so far as to say that it's borderline offensive to the memories of the men who died in it. I'm serious as fucking cancer. I said this before in my Gods and Generals review, but it bears repeating. You cannot authentically depict the battles of the Civil War without showing a grotesque, disgusting, egregious, gratuitous, gross, ghastly, filthy, wanton, sordid, horrible, sickening, nauseating amount of violence. Oh fuck, I dropped my thesaurus. This might be Gettysburg's biggest flaw, both in terms of artistic and historical value. A Civil War movie isn't doing its job unless I'm barfing into my popcorn bag, and Gettysburg falls woefully short of this sublime standard. Instead, the violence is sanitized, or worse, heroic, with the same triumphant Randy Edelman cue playing over every charge.
Yeah, the music was actually pretty baller in this movie. I'm not gonna lie, not necessarily appropriate, but fantastically baller.
And you know, the score of Gettysburg is a great piece of music on its own, but in the context of the film, it annoys me how much it seems to venerate the act of large numbers of men brutally murdering one another. Now, I figure the aim with including the score like this was to glorify the bravery of the soldiers, not war itself. But wouldn't that point be driven home more if we saw firsthand just how unbelievably violent Civil War combat really was? To be fair, I'm sure the small budget didn't do the special effects and makeup teams any favors, but you can't say that this film was flaccidly bloodless just because they originally shot it for TV. Gods and Generals had a much bigger budget, was shot for a theatrical run, and it has this problem too. The movie spent the better part of an hour building suspense for this charge, and again, most of that stuff is great. We've heard all about how this is basically a death.
Both of these movies, Gods and Generals, don't watch. It's horrendously bad. But both Gods and Generals and Gettysburg solely exist because of reenactors. And again, that very much became a consideration in what special effects were being used.
Sentence for Pickett's division. Several times we've seen Longstreet express his doubts and fears. We've seen men like Kemper and Armistead rise to the moment, nobly going to certain death because they have a duty to their men. And then the battle starts. It just doesn't look that dangerous, and these reenactors have these sort of bored expressions on their faces. They're not terrified or livid. They look like they're wondering what the catering crew is going to serve for lunch. They might as well be running through their drills for a school group at a living history encampment. Come on, guys, put the acting in reenacting. This is why I don't think that reenactors should be extras in major motion pictures. If it's a low-budget thing, then yeah, I mean, totally. But if you've got enough money to actually hire extras, get some 22-year-olds right out of drama school. You know, people who can actually act and who actually kind of look the part, look like Civil War soldiers. Reenactors should 100% be listened to. They should be there as historical consultants. They should vet all the uniforms. They should make sure that everything looks good and that everything's true to the period. But get the kids out of drama school, please. Whitewashing violence in a war movie doesn't just make for dull viewing. It trivializes the suffering of the actual soldiers who fought and died in that war. Now, I'm not saying that violence in movies can never be fun.
Because it's so much fun, Chan! Get it!
Or that every war movie has to be unrelentingly grim. But as a filmmaker, you need to be very careful about unintentionally glorifying armed conflict. And Pickett's charge was an absolute bloodbath. Before the assault even began, Union artillery from Cemetery Ridge tore through the ranks of Confederate infantry as they cowered under trees on Cemetery Ridge. When they finally emerged onto open ground, Federal gunners could start picking their targets, and the bombardment became even more destructive, taking off heads, limbs, and boring holes in chest cavities. As the advancing rebels came into range of the batteries positioned on Little Round Top, they were exposed to enfilading fire, meaning that Union gunners could shoot 12-pound cast iron balls down the entire length of an enemy column, mowing down dozens of men at a time. Faced with this horrendous fate, whole Confederate regiments broke and ran, colliding with their comrades advancing from behind, sowing confusion and chaos as the Iron Rain continued.
Enfilade is a depression in ground which will protect you from enfilading fire. More military science terms for you tonight.
Continued. The charge faltered as Confederate infantry struggled across the fences at the Emmitsburg Road, about halfway to Cemetery Ridge. Those who did make it over the fences with their lives came within rifle range, and United States troops fired in 4 ranks, offering an unrelenting hail of 50 to 60 caliber soft lead bullets that sometimes exploded as they passed through the body, ripping through internal organs like tissue paper. A few hundred Confederates reached the stone wall that protected the Union line, but they were easily outflanked and quickly repulsed at the points of swords, knives, and bayonets. By the end, the angle was soaked in blood and viscera, to say nothing of the thousands of dead and wounded that littered the fields for a mile to the west. When some pimply 17-year-old from North Carolina got his guts torn out by shrapnel and felt the world go dark as he stared at a patch of grass and shat himself, he did not hear Randy Edelman's rousing score in the background. He just fucking died. You know, back in the summer of 2013, when I lived and worked at Gettysburg, I took part in this Pickett's Charge Walk on 3 p.m. on July 3rd, the 150th anniversary. And it was led by these park rangers carrying big flags. It was all divided up into the three brigades of Pickett's division. You know, we had we were in Armistead's. Everybody, of course, wanted to be in Armistead's because, you know, of this fucking movie and Garnet and Kemper's. And it was stupid. I mean, there's a horde of tourists behind us, taking selfies, complaining about the heat, and we were standing next to these very surly, hardcore reenactors. And of course, we were in our shitty, Farby Confederate costumes. I'm sure they thought we looked really stupid. But I actually had a GoPro strapped to my head, so, you know.
Historically accurate GoPro.
Very authentic. But the whole thing was just, it was ridiculous. People were quoting lines from the movie. People were saying, Virginia! You know, it's just dumb. But as we got marching, I couldn't help but feel it, you know? Really feel it. By the time we got to the Emmitsburg Road, I was screaming Virginia and doing the rebel yell, and I was covered in sweat. My voice was hoarse. And we neared Cemetery Ridge. And, you know, from a mile back on Cemetery Ridge, I mean, you can't even see a line of people. They're just ants in Cemetery Ridge. You can't even see them. As you get closer, though, you know, the crowd of Union reenactors and tourists on Cemetery Ridge, it just grew larger and larger and larger. And by the time we got to the stone wall, I had just been thinking for however long it was, 20, 30 minutes, however long it took us to walk across that field. I was just thinking about what it would have been like to be a part of that. Kind of like that Faulkner quote, you know, about there isn't a Southerner alive who hasn't thought about what it would be like to cross that field on that day. And I got pretty choked up. And I remember reaching the stone wall. It was around the 57th Pennsylvania Monument, I think. I could be wrong, but I think it was. And there was this Union reenactor that I was passing by. I looked at this dude. He had tears in his eyes. And we just stared at each other for a second. And then he extended his hand, and I shook it. And he said something like, "I'm glad you're here." And I know that's cornier than a Ron Maxwell movie, but I'll never forget that.
So, I guess let's contextualize Pickett's Charge a little bit. You see a charge in the movies, and everybody fixes bayonets, and they lower their rifles, and they run across the field and the other guys. And that's not really how it works. So a Civil War charge, what's going to happen is you are going to advance in order, marching into musket range, and you're going to fire a shot. Then you're going to reload. And then you're going to continue marching. And then you're going to hit the last maybe 50 meters. And then you're going to start running. And it's not like a full pell-mell run. It is a charge. You're going to stay in formation. You're going to stay together. And you're not running to give yourself momentum or anything like that. You're running because you are desperately trying to get yourself into a headspace where you can go run into the enemy shooting at you, and that's assuming you haven't been shot yet. And that's assuming you haven't been shot yet. You're trying to get yourself into this headspace where you're charging into a line of bayonets that will stab you, and a hail of gunfire that will shoot you, and then you're trying to batter your way through that to win the fight beyond. And Pickett's Charge is about 1.5 miles of walking up to that point, uphill, to that final point where the Confederates are running into the Union line and there's just not enough of them left. They just die.
So, I've been bitching and moaning about this movie for God knows how long.
I'm so tired.
But I haven't actually offered up an overall concrete suggestion for how I would fix Gettysburg. And I'm not going to. I'm leaving it up to you. I'm calling upon the good people of the internet to make a fan edit of Gettysburg. It'll be called The 20th Maine. It'll start here, with the whole drama about the Maine mutineers. We can leave this speech in, because it's kind of essential to the narrative. Then we see him marching and stuff. I would prefer you cut out this speech, but I know a lot of people think it's the bee's knees, so I'll leave that up to you. Keep all the little round top stuff, of course, and also keep the scene where Chamberlain talks to Hancock about Armistead, just so we know who the fuck he is. Buster dies, blah blah blah, cut Pickett's charge down to like a 5-minute sequence, and when Tom asks the wounded Armistead his name, and he's like, "Tell General Hancock that General Armistead sends his regrets." It'll be a big reveal like, oh shit, that's him! And keep the end the same, with the brothers embracing as the sun sets. I want it cut down to a crisp 90 minutes, people. Get to it!
Okay. We're gonna call it here for tonight. I'm going to deliver you all to the magistrates and the shires in which you dwell. Get some sleep, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I appreciate everybody coming out. And we will probably be streaming something tomorrow, assuming Hetman is okay. We're gonna find out. It'll be a long day for me either way. And Wednesday, this Wick Donut debate is growing in size and scope on Twitter even as I speak. So we will see how big it gets. But I'll be debating Wick on Wick's show at regular Wick time of 6 Central. Alright, I gotta play everybody out.
Like a monkey, like a monkey, like a monkey. Monkey.